For those of you who don't know me, I am Kerry Duma. I am the chapter treasurer for Ann Arbor AGO. I'm also a part-time substitute organist, and in my spare time, I'm an attorney with the IRS Office of Chief Counsel in Detroit. I'm pleased this morning to have Jim Owen with us. Jim is a musician, lawyer as well, from Dayton, Ohio, and he has been legal counsel to AGO for a long time now. He's also been AGO National Counselor for Professional Development. He practices law in estate planning and probate. He also serves as a judge and music director at a church in Dayton, Ohio. So Jim is an expert in many of the areas we're going to talk about today, and I'll pipe in as needed, but I think Jim is going to lead the conversation. But before we get started, I think it would be a good idea if we go around and just introduce all of ourselves so that those of us who are new or haven't been here in a while can understand who else is in the room. So we'll start with our dean.
James Wagner from Ann Arbor chapter.
Robert Sokol, Ann Arbor chapter.
Steve Rice, Ann Arbor chapter.
Gail Kramer, Ann Arbor and Detroit.
Danny Forger, Detroit, Ann Arbor chapter.
Ford Boomline, Ann Arbor chapter.
Every Chase, no chapter.
You're an appreciator.
Aaron Stead.
I'm Marge Weil, and I'm visiting. I am not AGO, but an AGO member recommended I come to this. Our church is going into search for a new organist, choir director, and I have had 25 years in arts administration in the faculty area.
Which church are you serving?
First Presbyterian, downtown Battle Creek.
Oh, Battle Creek.
Yeah.
Craig Rifle, Detroit chapter.
Joan Haggard, Detroit chapter.
Stephen Fleck, Ann Arbor chapter and Southwest Michigan chapter.
Mary Sue Moore, no chapter.
Michelle Johns, Ann Arbor and Detroit.
Timothy Huth, co-sub-dean, Ann Arbor and Detroit.
And in the back we have Aaron Tan, co-sub-dean.
And somebody just coming in?
Co-sub-dean.
Come me?
Yeah.
Roberta Wackio, Lost Person, Detroit.
Well, you made it. Good. All right, well, Jim.
Okay. It's nice to be here. Thanks to everybody who's responsible for me standing up here this morning, especially my friend Joan Haggard, who's providing transportation. I'd like to encourage you all to just jump right in, ask questions as they come to mind, rather than saving 10-15 minutes at the end, because who knows how much time will be left. Might be an hour, might be nothing. So just jump right in. And I would ask you, first of all, to look over the handout, which looks like this, and so you get a general idea of what the topics are that we're going to be covering, and maybe hold off some questions you might have until we get to that time. And basically, we're talking about a three-part presentation: negotiating the contract itself, and worship styles. And I'm willing to alter the order of those if anybody feels real strongly about it, but I think we'll have time to get through everything. Well, let me say, first of all, because of the dire circumstances in Ohio, and by that I mean not enough organists being trained to do their thing, I hope your chapter is doing pedal pipes and pizza frequently, and or POEs, pipe organ encounters, or POE plus for the older organists. I've come to the conclusion those are absolutely necessary for the preservation of our profession. If we don't bring younger people along right now, there's just not going to be anybody when we retire. So pedal pipes and pizza, POEs, POE plus. When's the last time, have you had a PPP, pedal pipes and pizza, recently?
We have, yeah. Well, we did a POE last year.
There you go.
And still bear the scars of it, I want you to know. No, actually, it was a wonderful experience.
Financial scars or otherwise?
No, it was a wonderful,
Good scars.
wonderful week.
Oh,
Good
okay.
scars. We're happy.
You're kidding.
Oh, imagine that.
Can't be any levity here this morning. Don't look so serious, John.
What's POE plus? Is that for the old guys
Yes.
like me? Okay.
Let's just say older than teenage.
Oh, okay. That's why I didn't go to the one he's talking about.
Okay, let's also clear the air with the word guild and the word union. As you all know, we are not a union. We don't have collective bargaining rights. We don't have closed shop. Anybody can be an organist if they, pass the audition at the church and get hired. This is useful to know because when you start approaching your church people about higher salary, you don't want them to get the idea that you belong to a union, because you don't. And the AGO can do very little to force an employer to pay you any particular salary. So we're a guild, and there's nothing wrong with a guild, because a guild goes back hundreds of years. I think of the Flemish guilds where people belong to a tradesman in order to learn from one another. So that's basically what we are, and it's something to be proud of. Another problem is bad salaries. So we're going to be talking about that quite a bit. I'm going to try to give you some helpful hints on how to get your salary up if it's low. We'll also talk about labor mobility. There's one thing I can't do, and that is increase the gross receipts of your church. If you're on a shoestring budget, I don't know what to tell you. There's no pie to cut up. But on the other hand, if there's a considerable amount of money in the parish, and you're just not getting a big enough piece of the pie, there may be something you can do. But it may be time, as I've found, to look for another job. So keep that in mind. And I find that the Lord does not close one door without opening another one. And I can't tell you strongly enough how the best jobs I've had have been jobs that I've acquired after I left a church under less than desirable circumstances. So don't be afraid to go west, young man, young woman, because that's maybe where your salvation is. Labor mobility. And demographics. What's the state of the church in your particular community? We're going to be talking about contemporary worship. I don't know how to define that, except to define it as what the teenagers are listening to on the radio in your town at that time. That's how I define contemporary worship. I've fought that battle several times, and that's the only definition I can come up with that makes sense, because that's what you're facing, at least in the situations I've had. Okay, turning to negotiating a contract. Actual employment goals. I don't think any of us has everything. I know people who love the pastor, love the choir, but the organ's a piece of junk. Or if it's a nice organ, it's great liturgy, the building's bad, the acoustics are terrible. You know, there's always something wrong, so I don't think it's sensible to go out there and try to find the perfect job. It's a compromise. So decide for yourselves what you really want the most and go for it. You can't have it all. Usually it starts with you finding a need for a job. If you already have one, a need to change your job, you start talking to people. You might read an ad or something like that and get a resume going. I'm not going to stand up here and spend a lot of time on resumes, because you can find a ton of information on the internet about how to prepare a resume. But do keep it up to date. Keep it short. Some experts say a page. Some people say 2 pages. Make sure it's relevant. You might have a PhD in the age of Beowulf. More power to you. It's not going to help you necessarily. There are research tools that you acquire by getting a graduate degree. No question about it. Things like that help you in anything you're doing. But don't expect to sell yourself to a church as a musician by relying on an English PhD, because it's probably not going to help you. Make sure the thing is neatly laid out, that the appearance is appropriate. I wouldn't mention salary requirements until at least the first or second interview. I think the first thing you want to do is sell yourself, sell your skills, and then we'll talk about money. Make sure they know everything you can bring to them, everything you have to offer, and then we'll talk about money.
How would you handle the situation that frequently comes up where the job posting says, please list your salary requirements?
Then I maybe would list a range, but I wouldn't list a specific amount. And remember, lawyers know this, you never start with your bottom line. You always start with more than your bottom line. Very important. Don't give it up. And don't negotiate against yourself, where you finally sit down at a meeting and you're talking salary, and you throw a number out there and they say, oh, we can't afford that. And then you throw another. No. Make sure they come back with a offer before you give them a second offer. Emphasize what you can do for them. In my job, I provide quite a bit of variety. I have 3 services every weekend. So variety has become a necessity because the 3 services are not identical. And every service is blended, right? I mean, if you're doing even a service that's all Bach, you got a Bach cantata, the prelude, postlude is going to be from a different period of his life, so isn't all worship blended, essentially? The only question is how much is it blended? So I think you want to make sure you understand what kind of blended worship they want if you're going into that situation. But in any case, be prepared to offer variety and quality. Okay, the interview. And we have a time requirements worksheet, which we'll go to right now. This is in your handout. And I've been told by a person sitting in this room that his salary was doubled. And I think in no small part to this document.
It was you.
I don't have that.
I think there's a file over there.
You don't have a worksheet?
I don't have that one we're talking about.
Well, you already earn enough. You don't need to up your salary. You don't have it?
No. You need this to present your
It's not in there.
No.
Well, now I do need it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
I've actually
just
seen
need
it. It's okay,
Xeroxed.
Jim, thank you.
That's all right.
And most of these documents are available on the AGO website. Please tell me that you use it. Because our model contract is up there. That's a fantastic document. This worksheet is up there. Salary chart is up there. Other fees and costs are up there. And some of that you do have in your outline. But anyway, this is a document that enables you to sit down right now and figure out how much you're getting paid per hour.
I can see if I can copy that if you'd like.
Okay.
Thank you.
And why is that important? Well, don't you want to know what you're worth? I think it's a good thing. And more importantly, at least for me in my past, was to find out what I make now, based upon what I'm earning now and what work I'm doing now, so that I can ask for more if I take on more duties. You know, the more duties thing is called job creep. So you want to make sure you're prepared for job creep and that you get compensated for it and not end up doing a lot of work that you're not paid for. By the way, I'm going to ask who's who. As far as instrumentalists, I'm going to ask organist, organist director, and choir director, clergy. So hold up your hand if you're a choir director. Only choir director. Only choir director. Nobody's just a choir director. How about organist only? Organist director. Okay, clergy. We can talk freely. Be nice. In your employment situation, you have to be nice. Don't be nasty. Be nice and smile. A harsh word with a harsh tone is to be avoided. You can mix and match, but never combine a harsh word. That's coming later. Okay, and we have at least one person who's not connected to the actual music in the church, but you're going to hire somebody. Is that right? Okay, great. So look online for the various documents, including the time requirements worksheet. Because what you do is you go through the worksheet and you put down the number of hours you spend on all these tasks. Maybe you found some that aren't on the sheet, you add those, and you come up with a total number of hours per week. And then maybe you can compute your payment, your salary per week. For example, let's say you make $500 a week and you can do your job in 10 hours. Kind of extreme maybe. Okay, $50 an hour. So you say to yourself, well, they want me to take on this new ensemble. It's going to take at least 2 hours. So it's easy to figure out what additional bump up you need in your salary to compensate you. So that's the purpose of it. But some of you will find it a very big surprise what your present hourly rate is. 10 hours a week, I can't do my job in 10 hours a week. 12 is probably the minimum, and it's probably more like 14 or 16 when you factor in meetings and things like that. Okay? So that's the purpose of that worksheet. You'll find it very enlightening. Your education and experience are very important. Be prepared to discuss your average job tenure and ask about theirs. A musician who stays 6 months or a year in a church, and we've heard stories about that, raises questions. And not only if they ask you and you give that answer, but you need to ask them, what's been the shortest tenure in your parish by an organist or an organist director in the last 20 years? See what they say. I think all things like this belong on the table. That's just the way I feel. If you use a lot of sick leave, be careful of that. That can come back to haunt you. They may ask you about that. Have you been on time? You don't want to show up late for a service. You might get a recording. Then you'll really be sorry. Best, worst experiences, specific problems and solutions. one of the biggest problems can be interpersonal relationships between you as the organist, for example, and the choir director. Because organists are sometimes expected to be behind the console, cowering to the demands of the choir director or the pastor. And choir directors somehow, and this is maybe just a stereotype I have in my mind, choir directors are supposed to be outgoing because they deal with people, i.e. the choir. And those of us who do both, I guess we're supposed to be a little bit of each. But that can raise problems. There's chain of command problems. How do you handle the pastor? What's going on in the church? What's the employer's salary history and program history? If you're coming into a church that's just turned corners or taken on a new direction, that's a red flag, because I would want to know why, and I would want to know where they're going or where they want to go. Especially, number 8, any short-term or long-term worship re-engineering plans in place. Now, how many of you are lucky enough to, I call it Church of the Advent Boston situation?
What was that again?
Church of the Advent Boston. It's a high church, smells and bells, no contemporary worship, at least as far as I heard last time I talked to anybody. Edith Ho was there for many years. Does anybody have that situation? Maybe it's a beautiful Episcopal church in a county seat town here in Michigan, and it's well endowed, millions in the bank in stocks, bonds, and investments, and you don't have to do anything you don't want to do, and which is music that you want to do, and nothing anybody asks you to do. Nobody has that situation.
I mean,
Do you have that?
occasionally, I sub a lot. There are a few parishes, mainly in the Detroit area, that are lucky enough to be able to do that, but it's pretty rare.
Yeah, it is rare. So how many of you dabble in contemporary music? How many of you don't, I guess I should ask. Yeah. And how do you get away with that? I'm just being blunt.
Because I'm a substitute.
Oh, okay.
So am I.
So you come in and basically they're happy to have what you do.
No, I just don't come in if they don't want to do what I want to do.
Let me just say, there's only one church in Dayton, Ohio, and I'll be honest, it's a Westminster Presbyterian Church where the choir college started under John Finley Williamson in 1926. They don't do contemporary worship. Every other church that's paying bills essentially does contemporary worship. I don't know what kind of contemporary worship they do, whether it's what the teenagers are hearing on the radio in that community, but they do it. Some churches, there's a vibrant Methodist church in the suburbs that does 2 or 3 on Sunday morning, and the organist director does all the services. I think there are 4 or 5 on a Sunday morning, and he's literally running from room to room. But it's a very healthy church. It's working. Never combine harsh words with harsh tone of voice. Never place your ultimate position on the table as your first position. We talked about that. Anticipate their vital goals and needs. And you maybe can't do that until you ask them some questions. What are your vital goals and needs? What are you looking to hire here? What can I do to make this music ministry successful? Put items in your offer which provide rewards to the opposing party and which speak to their personal individual agendas. For example, you learn that somebody on the committee that's interviewing you lost a spouse. You know, you can talk about memorial services that you've done. Speak to them personally. I see grimacing over here. Those can be very troubling, can't they, memorial services, but mean a lot to the people. How about wedding vow reaffirmation? You know, people like stuff like that. Maybe we don't like to do it because the music that is called for is not really good music in our opinion, but it's important to know if they want it. Because if they want it, you're not going to do it. Maybe you don't belong in that church. Overcome inertia with good reasons for disregarding that we've always or never done it that way. We've all heard that. We've never done that before. Why should we do it now? Be prepared to tell them why. The church is changing. The demographics are changing. What worked in 1952 doesn't work anymore. Maybe in your situation. Nothing's off the record. I confess that I have gone to interviews over the years when I wasn't really looking for a job, especially when I was on the National Committee for Career Development and Support, because I wanted to know what was going on in the interview process so that I could write articles for the TAO and things like that. And I went to a Presbyterian church in a small county seat town outside of Dayton, and we sat there real collegially for about an hour and 15 minutes. Then I went and I played something for them, then we came back. And then there was a little coffee hour, a little coffee break. So they had asked me all very appropriate questions up until that point in time. And then we had the coffee break, and the ringleader of the bunch comes up to me and he says, "You're married, aren't you? Tell me about your family." Now, isn't that interesting? That was a question they didn't feel comfortable asking in the interview, but they had to have the answer, didn't they?
It's illegal, correct?
We get into that in a few minutes. What's legal and what's illegal.
Yeah.
Churches, clergy, let's be honest, let's put everything on the table. The clergy and the boards that run your churches have a lot of latitude that the supermarket doesn't have, or that the University of Michigan doesn't have. And that's because the courts don't want to interfere in church doctrine. A court will hear a case to decide whether you're really following the doctrine you say you have. But they're not going to judge the doctrine because they just don't want to get into that because of First Amendment problems. And they don't have time for it. And you know, there used to be 3 rules that a court could follow. They didn't interfere at all. They interfered all the time. Or number 3 is kind of a hybrid situation. They kind of picked and chose which ones they wanted to interfere with and tried to tell the church what it was supposed to do. But the courts are increasingly in a hands-off position. But there's a case I want to talk about later. Redford, Michigan, is that around here? Oh, yeah. Hosanna, Tabor, Lutheran Church and School, it's LCMS, I believe. Anyway, versus the EEOC. And you can find, I'll write that on the board in a minute, you can find that if you Google it on any search engine. Interesting result. Okay, nothing's off the record. Oh yeah, number 15. I want to spend a little bit of time on this. I'm not trying to tell you legally what to do, and the disclaimer covers that on page 1. But I hear an awful lot of, I can't get a contract because the church won't give me one. And I usually hear, well, they've never offered anybody a contract. And they never will offer anybody a contract. That's a real problem. Naturally, as lawyers, we like contracts. But there are reasons for liking contracts. Number 1, you can refer to it from time to time to know what you're supposed to do. It sounds ridiculous, but in a liturgical church, you have a lot of duties. 3 services every weekend, multiple choir situation. Advent comes along. Gee, they're having Advent services. Is that included in my salary, or do I get paid extra for that? Same thing with Lenten services. You have to know. I refer to it regularly because I don't remember. I don't trouble myself with details that maybe other people do. I want to concentrate on other things. There's enough administrative stuff, isn't there? You want to play. Yeah, Michelle?
Can you tell us the difference between a job description and a contract?
Sure. A contract is a document governing the relationships, the promises between 2 parties, in this situation, the church and you. It has to have mutuality, otherwise it's a gift. In other words, you have to do something for what you get. There has to be a meeting of the minds. There has to be consideration passing, something paid for something lying, and there can't be fraud, duress, things like that that would render it illegal or unlawful, unenforceable. As opposed to a job description, which is just a list of things that you're expected to have in mind when you apply for the job. Notice I didn't even say things that you're expected to do when you get the job. And the problem is they may try to be a little bit flashier with their job description than they really are. They may represent things in the job description that you'll never see. So don't rely on a job description to be a contract. Don't even rely on a workbook or an employee manual necessarily. Employee manuals are an important part of employment law, but only if they're signed by both parties or incorporated by reference into the contract. So chances are if you walk into a church and take a job based on a job description, you're really nowhere. If you take it based on the employee handbook that they give you, you may be nowhere. It may not be enforceable. So anyway, they don't want to give you a contract. So you go to the interview and you take copious notes. You write down everything you're talking about, and in the margin you write down with a check mark or something everything you're agreeing to. And then at the end of the interview, you say, well, I presume so-and-so will do the contract. Oh, we don't do contracts. We've never had a contract. We never give our musicians a contract. So where are you? Well, you don't have a contract, but you have a list of items you've agreed to. And what I would do and I'm not specifically advising you to do this because you might lose your job, but I would definitely memorialize that thing in the way of a letter to them, especially if you're hired. And you say, based upon our interview, I understand these are the following job duties that I will be expected to perform for the salary of blank. So I'm relying on this as a list of my duties. And what can they say? You're fired before you're hired? Are they going to say, no, that's not our agreement? Well, then what is? So be proactive. Don't let this lack of contract mire you down. Do something to get one, even if it's just a letter confirming what you agreed on orally, because that's what's going to be important. What did you agree to? Don't negotiate against yourself. Wait before modifying your overstated proposals. That goes back with what I said, always ask for more than you're willing to take. You getting all this down? Driving too hard a bargain could haunt you later. Yeah, might be an excuse to terminate you if you ask for a higher than normal salary and you don't perform. When selling your goals, avoid personal attacks, break down large issues into small ones, stress facts and real-world constraints, start with easier subjects and success experiences and all that. Don't attack former clergy. That'd be a red flag for anybody interviewing you. And they may try to goad you into talking about it, but I would just hands off that. I wouldn't browbeat anybody or talk negatively about anybody in any job I've ever had. I don't think they want to hear it, but they might want to know whether you're the type of person who would talk about it. Salary comes up. Okay, that's a large issue that maybe needs to be broken down into a compensation package, which is just another term for salary, but also benefits, right? And it may be that that church will be able to spend less money putting you on the health insurance policy than you would have to pay for an individual policy. That's important to know because it's a win-win situation for both the employer and the employee. So try to break things down. Always smile at them. Don't be afraid to share personal experiences and find a way to continue the talks, which is just like saying, be patient, be congenial, don't stand up, walk out the door and slam it. You know, be the one who's not closing the door on the negotiations. Let them close it if anybody does. Always keep the door open because they may call you. You know, maybe you're being given the impression you're not the right person for the job because somebody's coming in an hour who they think is, who doesn't turn out to be right for the job, so they call you. So always have a fallback position. Other research should be done through the chapter placement chair, word of mouth, absolutely. I wouldn't take a job without talking to the predecessor, even if I don't know the person. 12 years ago, almost 13 years ago, I took my present job. The predecessor was only there 6 months. Boy, did I want to know why. And I didn't want to count on what the church had to tell me, so he lived in Toledo. I got his number and I called him. And it turned out to be something innocuous. The church was not at fault. He needed to move. But I want to know that. If they've had short tenured musicians, there may be a problem. I've been doing grievances, not recently in the AGO, but for 3 years I kind of handled everything that crossed my desk, and that was every grievance that was filed. And we had some troublesome grievances across the country. People who moved 3,000 miles for a job that turned out to be nothing. People who got fired after 17, 20, 22 years of service. There's some real horror stories out there. But I have found over the years that one particular church, I won't mention it, but it's in this region, did a pretty bad job on an organist some years ago. And this is good to know. He left that church, went to a state down south, changed denominations, and he's as happy as a lark. And only now does he realize how mistreated he was, but how good it was to get out of that church. Well, I pick up TAO. That church is looking for another organist. And this is like 15 years ago when he left. And they've had some problems right along. So if they're mistreating him, chances are they're mistreating other people too. That'll come back to haunt them. Okay, any other questions on negotiating the contract? Yes.
Could you speak to number 7 a bit? If you don't know your predecessor in the position you want, how do you ferret out an employer's salary history?
Well, you can always ask them.
Yeah, are they gonna tell you the truth?
I don't know.
Yeah.
You can talk to, you don't know who the predecessor is that what you're saying?
For instance, yeah.
That's certainly a fair question, who is it?
No, but I mean, if you don't know who it is, or they don't want to discuss it.
Okay. Well, I think I would want to know at the interview what their range is, what they have paid in the past and what they expect to pay in the future.
So that's a fair question.
Oh, I think so, yeah. Maybe not at the first interview, but as soon as the talk turns to money, I think you want to get information like that.
Could you ask to see the budget?
I think that's a little pushy, the first interview, and maybe even pushy at any time. But, good question, because I want to see evidence of what they provide as far as choir robe cleaning, music library. Do you bring your own music in? Do they have a budget for you purchasing organ music? And if so, who does it belong to? Is it theirs? You have to leave it when you go, or is it yours? You can take it with you when you go. And all other things, professional soloists, anything for a brass quartet for Easter Sunday, all kinds of questions like that I think you need to know, because you want to be sure there's money there, and you want to know if they expect you to do it. Joan, did you have a question?
Yes, something else that I ran into in one of the jobs, I felt that I was entitled to have Social Security taken from my paycheck. And they decided no, they weren't going to do that. They were going to have somebody set up a private account for me. And
what kind of an account? What kind of an account?
I don't remember, an IRA or something like that.
We're talking about withholding taxes, aren't we? Are you saying that they wanted to treat you as an independent contractor?
Yes.
Oh, that's a
That
no-no.
is it.
Oh, no. Don't ever fall for that.
Well, actually, I happen to know somebody down at the diocese, and I told him about this, and the bishop came down on the record, and they started taking Social Security.
Okay, let's stop right now. This is a very sore spot with me, because I ran into this in a small town in southwest Ohio. I was there 9 years. They treated me as an independent contractor, which means they did not withhold taxes, which means you have to estimate them quarterly. Jump right in here.
You're doing a good job.
Number 2, they don't contribute to any of the withholding. Under the law, if you're an employee, you pay half, it's deducted from your check, and they contribute the other half. But number 3, and most importantly, I have never met an organist who is not an employee. They try to tell you you're an independent contractor, say, okay, well, I'm going to play Sunday service on Monday afternoon at 3:30. Like a plumber, like an electrician. No, you're an employee, there's no such, now, except for weddings and funerals, perhaps, and some other exceptions, like a sub may be an independent contractor. But if you're the regular organist, choir director, organist director at that church, and you're doing your job, you are an employee, I'm sorry. And we get to a 20-point test in a few minutes, and it'll jump right out at you that, with a few exceptions, you're an employee. There may be some points in the 20 that fit independent contractor a little better, like you bring your own music with you and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
One thing I've had a little confusion about is denominational roles. So I started at, let's say, a Presbyterian church, and I had a contract, and I reported to the session and so forth. And then I served in the session of another Presbyterian church, and I found the rules were interpreted completely differently.
What rules?
Tax
rules?
Well, just things like they said Presbyterian churches don't have contracts, or, or one doesn't report to the session, one reports to the senior pastor.
They're just BSing you. That's what they're doing, I'm sorry. It's not true. All Presbyterians are held to the same standard, the same laws that all Methodists are.
But in a church, the clergy are the ones who the congregation likely will look to interpret such rules. And if the clergy come down one way, what do you do about that?
And is the question one of having a contractor or being an independent contractor, for example?
Let's say having it not independent contractor, I think legally that's clear, but things like, should one have a contract?
Okay,
Or, you know, should one report the session or the secret
Let's
contract?
jump right away to page 4.
Okay.
And your job is to make them understand item Roman numeral 3, A through J. What employer would expect you to work without a contract? One without a clear vision for the present or future, one wanting to make it up as it goes along, one that's never used contracts before, one with present conflict, one with tenuous membership financial prospects, one that's gun-shy due to legal predicaments, one that's so advised by hierarchy legal counsel, one that deems your work insignificant, one that thinks you'll do whatever's asked, and one that assumes you'll know what's wanted. My voice kind of goes up as I go through these. I don't care if you want to show them this. You may not get the job, but they need an attitude adjustment. They need an attitude adjustment because if you're working as an organist in a church, you're an employee and you need to know what the agreement is. So do the letter if all else fails. Do the letter, a little memorandum of my understanding of our agreement at the meeting, and send it to them. I wouldn't send it certified mail, that's red flag, but send it. Yes.
I was going to say regarding Social Security, I had a long tenure at a church, and someplace along the way they decided, I believe they were in reduced financial straits, they decided to change me to an independent contractor. And I began keeping track of my mileage to and from Detroit from here, and was able to salvage what I thought was okay for me, and I did continue to get some raises as time went on. So I guess I would say that it isn't a great issue, but in connection with the very first thing you said, no job is otherwise perfect, and so that was a good enough balance for me. I also noticed that early on I did have a contract, and as years went by, the new people forgot that there was a contract, and if I needed to remind them, wait a minute, I have this many days of vacation, I could do that, but I didn't really expect that the people 15 years on were going to remember that I had made a contract with some other people 15 years ago, and that they would find.
I gotta tell you, I've had a contract every year for as long as I can remember, but in my present job, mine wasn't actually signed until March of this year. And I don't know why they were dragging. Of course, the church, what is it today, May 5th, this church where I work, it's an ELCA Lutheran church, has had 3 council presidents since January 1st. Which is a whole other problem.
Yes.
And the bottom line there is, and I'm going to be stepping on some toes, do not join the church where you work. You don't need that closeness. You don't need that partnership. You don't need that doctrine and all those headaches that go with that. And don't ever let them talk you into serving on the governing board. That could be a conflict of interest, number one. But you just don't need to be that close to their problems. And they have problems. Every church has problems. But remind them gently of it's time to renew the contract. You know, we have 2 forms on the website. One is a contract that is totally revised each year, and the other form is a contract where the compensation is revised. So in that situation, I think I'd use the second type of contract where maybe it's just the end of the last page that if you got a raise, it revises your salary. Everything else remains the same. But be sure you update the contract as to job duties and responsibilities, because you know that job creep needs to be compensated. Okay. And let me just talk a little bit about negotiating a salary and reaching that salary. I used to think that, let's say this is the church on this side. There's a divide line. This is the church on this side, and this is a lower salary over here. And on the right-hand side is you and a higher salary. Okay, see, I'm going to try to get together here and arrive at a magic number. Church, lower salary, you, higher salary. I used to think that that magic number was reached like this. There was a number right there, where the church met you, where lower met higher. But the more I think about it, the more convinced I am, this is just another theory of bargain and sale, but I like it, that as you're negotiating and approaching one another and coming together, that really you arrive at a number, not because you agree on that number, but theoretically because the church really thinks you're worth more and you think you're worth less. And why is that important? Because after your annual review, if they have thought that they got you for less than you're worth, they may be more inclined to give you a raise, especially if you're doing more duties. So think of it that way, that you're really passing in the night, but locking on a number because they are hiring you thinking you're worth more, and you're being hired because you think you're worth less. Might help you, might work for you. So compensation, employee status. What about weddings and funerals? That's another reason to have a written contract. Some churches have a lot of weddings. Most have a lot of funerals. Our ratio is about 10 to 1. Our church is not in trouble, membership-wise, and certainly not financially, but we have about 10 funerals to every wedding. The church is graying, the population is aging, and then you die. So have that in your contract. Lots of things to have in your contract, just look on the website. Cost of living increases, merit raises, all something to talk about at your annual review. Please be sure your contract contains a provision for annual review and that you have it. And just gently nudge them. If that annual review doesn't take place by the end of January, tell them you want one. Remind them it's in the contract. Hopefully it's there. Benefits, vacation. You know, somebody was talking about vacation. Does it accrue or is it lost if it's not used in that year? Very important questions. Insurance, we talked about that a while ago. Deferred compensation, are you getting a pension or some kind of an IRA? Most of us don't. Most of us are part-time. Full-time people would tend to get that. That's not any reason not to ask for one or to discuss it, because it may cost them less to do it than it costs you to do it on the side. Severance. This is the most important reason, in my opinion, to have a contract. Because under local law and local custom, you might not be entitled to very much notice of termination. But that's a good reason to have a contract. Now, I know Michigan's an employment at will state, and so is Ohio, and a lot of states are. That's all the more reason to have a contract. I used to have people tell me, well, my state is employment at will. Yeah, that's why you need a contract, because the contract trumps the state employment at will situation. So if you're entitled to 6 months notice, and it's in a contract, you're pretty well off. But if you don't have a contract, and the custom in the area is a week, 2 weeks, and maybe just turn in your keys, Joan, you're out, you know, what are you going to do? Got nothing to fall back on. I don't mean to use you as an example like it's happened to you, but...
That's good.
You just got the Joan look.
And I've gotten it many times, and it won't be the last.
There were no harsh words, though, at the same time.
You did want to walk back to Dayton, right?
All I have to do is get to the airport. Never mind. Duties and responsibilities, another important reason to have a contract. Specific problems. Ask them what problems they've had with worship and employment situations in the past. I think it's a fair question. And I only ask because I want to be sure and avoid that myself, if I would. Money is allowed for employee responsibilities, year-to-date printouts. You know, that's the budget thing where they show you how much you've spent so far on choir music, and I do keep a record of that, but it's helpful to know what they think you've spent. Well, I worked in an Episcopal church for 13 years, and I would be told by the treasurer that I was over budget. No, I've kept a record of how much. Well, no, they bought Bibles for the confirmands. Well, so that's not a music item. I'm glad they did, but I need to know that if I'm going to spend that much less on choir music. The rectors thought they were entitled to use my money because it was a book. Physical changes. when I went to my present church 13 years ago, we needed some structural changes because the organ console was not in front of the choir. It was off to the side, and the choir was on nave floor level. And there was this glaring, lighted stained glass contraption behind the choir, and I was actually worried that my eyes would suffer from that because the lights behind it were pretty bright. So I had a three-pronged proposal for them structurally. Number one, they had to move the console. They understood that. Number two, they had to raise the choir, and they built a platform, but they wouldn't move the window. Well, I knew they weren't going to move the window. You always ask for more. Right, then you're willing to take because then they think they've won. That's important. It's the saving face. Right? Okay, administrative help. My present church, I can safely say, and this is after like 40 years of practicing law and 45 years of working with church secretaries, that the best secretary I've ever worked with has been at my present church, legal or church secretary, and so has the worst. And what causes that problem to occur? Well, they don't interview the applicants thoroughly enough. But what do you do when you find yourself in a standoff situation with another employee? Mainly you keep your mouth shut, be real careful who you talk to, but this woman, well, I planned 90 days ahead. That bothered her. She said, why don't you just give me the stuff the week before the Sunday? And that's just not the way I operate. So I explained to her, I don't operate that way. She got mad at me because I was giving her stuff 90 days ahead. She couldn't process it. She couldn't organize it. But be careful what you say. Okay, because if you turn off the wrong person, you're out. And we've maybe all been in that situation. I remember when I worked in this Presbyterian church for 9 years. It's the only church job I really lost before I wanted to lose it, shall we say. I wasn't really fired, but they made it attractive for me to leave. And for 9 years, I saved thank you cards. You know, the pile was that high. I had rubber bands around it. And I knew a termination meeting was coming, so I brought this stack of thank you notes. It didn't mean anything. Once the pastor decided I was history, that was it. And maybe that's the way it should be. But don't be unrealistic in your expectations. Don't think that certain people backing you up is going to make a difference. It may not be. Be flexible. Think in alternatives. Remember what's variable and what's fixed. Always ask for more than you plan to accept. Don't be the one to terminate the negotiations. That's a good trait, and it helps if you're an employee anyway. Okay, need for a written contract, unless there are any questions. Duties, compensation, benefits. We've talked about a lot of these things. New clergy and staff, they may forget or disregard what they've done in the past. That might be good, but maybe it's not. Maybe they need to steer a more stable course. At least you don't want to be in the middle of trouble if they change course.
I have a question. I'm not sure if it pertains to what we're talking about now or what happened previous, but as a part-time person, there are some certain tax advantages, even as an employee. We mentioned mileage, but as I understand, we'll get counsel to back me up here, as a part-time person, all of a sudden I've got a second job, and as I understand it, mileage on the second job is deductible. Am I right about that?
As always, the answer depends.
Mileage for the IRS. You know
That's
that.
why I'm asking them.
Mileage is tricky, and if you go to irs.gov, there's a section for self-employed, or a section for individuals, and then a section for self-employed people. Or you could just use the search term and search for mileage deductions. There are varying situations in which you can deduct your mileage. The one that's going to apply to most of us is if you, if you're an employee and they ask you to go somewhere and they're not going to reimburse you, that's deductible. If you're an independent contractor, you're not an employee, you can deduct mileage traveling from job site to job site, but only if you have a primary location. As a substitute, one of the disadvantages I have is I don't have a primary job location. I don't have an office, and all of my travel is in the metropolitan area. I can't deduct that mileage. So you have to be very careful about what situation you're in and what the specific facts of why you're going from place to place. And I think, again, if you go to irs.gov, they have publications that lay out those various scenarios. So you have to be careful.
Joe?
Yeah, did you say if you're strictly doing substitute work, that is deductible or is not?
It's probably not, because you don't have one fixed location that you have to
lovely,
go
I've
to.
been deducting it for 10 years.
Well, I'm gonna need you to stay after.
Oh, she's staying. Oh, she's staying.
No, it's not to say you can't. I'm a substitute and I deduct some of mine, but it depends on whether you have a primary location. And we can talk a little bit about it after. And honestly, I mean, I probably shouldn't be saying this. That's not the type of thing that's going to get you audited on its by itself. I mean, the things that get you in big trouble are if you're deducting half of your home as a home office, and your expenses exceed your income. But so we can talk about specific situations. But in general, if you're going to multiple locations and not to one specific one more often than not, it's not deductible.
I thought it counted as a charitable donation.
Are you a charity?
No?
Only if the charity asks you to drive on their behalf. It's sort of like being an employee. And the deduction for charitable is only 14 cents a mile. It's not a big.
Joan, you're getting in deep.
So yeah, we're getting off. We can talk about it after,
It's
but
always worth a try.
But that brings up an interesting point. I think there's a lot more to the job I do than coming in and rehearsing the choir and playing the organ or the synthesizer or the piano, whatever it is. I think social matters are very important because I look at it as a music ministry, and I take my choir to dinner every May. I always have. And we have a picnic every summer, and we have a gathering usually after the first rehearsal and a nice Christmas party, and I've spent some money in May on these choir dinners because I invite the whole family, as long as I call it the residential immediate family. If you've got a live-in partner that may not qualify, they don't abuse it too much. But one year a woman wanted to bring her ex-husband and his family from another town, and I thought, and pay for it. And I said, that's not the point that you bring these distant relatives and you pay for it. Think about what it's for. It's a reward for the commitment of being in the choir, and that's the immediate family that is sacrificing so that you can be at church at 7:30 on Wednesday. So, deductible or not, I don't know, and I won't say whether I've deducted it or not, but there are expenses like that, and I think some of them are and some of them aren't. It tends to be fact sensitive, doesn't it, Carrie?
yeah, it really depends, and to the extent you have specific questions, we can talk about it.
But there are red flags that the IRS sees, and home office deduction is a biggie. So if you're going to try to do that, and I've had these questions come up in the AGO. Well, is my $185,000 track or organ deductible? It's in my living room,
Yeah.
So you can see the IRS's position right away. People get kind of greedy, don't they? Okay, AGO grievance procedures. I'm under contracts, room number 1I. By the way, David Lamb is your new regional counsel. He's our new regional counsel as a result of the election. And all of the national incumbents were re-elected. Okay. I'm sorry to say the grievance procedures are about to go by the boards. They've been in place ever since I can remember. Have you ever had a grievance in the Ann Arbor chapter? Oh boy. Have you?
Yes.
Did Don Williams file one?
Well, they're discontinuing them. The procedures are kind of convoluted, as anything is. It's trying to spell out rights and obligations. Most of the changes coming in the AGO structure are driven by financial considerations. This one's not, because the AGO grievance procedures don't cost very much, if anything, to use. But they do require a lot of time on the part of the local chapter, and I think that's what's driving the fact they're being thrown out. Chapters have other things to do, and grievance investigations are not among them.
I remember, I'm not sure if he actually filed or not, but we did have a situation like that, and that was, I was on the board I've been on the board forever, but it was really messy. And people did not want to get involved. It was just really tough all the way around for everybody, and a lot of suffering on the part of the person who was the one that filed it. A lot of suffering.
Let me say you're not totally without help, though, because about 6 years ago we started a mentoring program, and as soon as it was put on the website, the fact it wasn't being used really jumped out at me, screaming. Here's this great program, and I don't think it's been used in the 6 years it's been there. But I'm not too disappointed, because my impression is that you folks, we all mentor each other anyway, informally. And it was a little too legalistic. It was available on the chapter level, the regional level, the national level. There were 3 documents to be signed. Lawyers get into something and it really gets convoluted, doesn't it, Gary? So continue your informal mentoring, because I think that's going to be the salvation when the grievance procedures go out the window. I'm sorry to see that, but I understand it. It's a volunteer organization. We all have jobs and other things to do. So, number 2, bottom of page 3, don't rely on any of these things as a substitute for a written contract. It's not going to fly. And Roman number 3 on page 4, we've already gone over that. The Roman number 4, the 20-point test. I think you'll find that on the last page of the handout, page 8. I think this is from the IRS website. This is a checklist to help you decide, or help the church decide, whether you are an employee or an independent contractor. And a couple of the things will apply to church organists, but like I said, I've never met a regular church organist who is not an employee, because you can't work like a plumber or an electrician. So if you have any questions about those, we could discuss them. And the right to control the means and manner of the work is one of the most important things. There are benefits to being an employee that are not available to an independent contractor, and they're listed in Roman numeral 4. Employees can have contracts and should have contracts, and that's where your rights and responsibilities are set out. Okay? And then Roman numeral 5, we already said Michigan's an employee at will state, and so is Ohio. And that's one reason you need a contract more than ever. Now, there's some reasons, or some ways, I suppose, where a church would be ending up on the wrong side of the dispute, but they're few and far between. The exceptions are, number 1, an implied contract. A contract might be implied in fact if you were hired to do A, B, C, D. You did A, B, C, D, but they only paid you for A, B, C. Over a long period of time, the contract would be implied that you were hired and they should pay you for A, B, C, D. But we do more than 4 things. It gets kind of dicey if you don't have it in writing. Then you've got to determine whether there's a specific term for this contract, this implied, in fact, contract. You take a job at a church, they won't give you anything in writing. Well, how long are you good for at that church? Is it a year? Is it 6 months? Is it 1 week? Is it after you play the first hymn? I don't know. That's another reason to have a contract. The employee handbook may not, yes.
I'm sorry. You talked about this employee at will, and you say Michigan and Ohio are both states that have it. Can you elucidate that a little more, especially by contrast to a state that does not have employee at will?
Some states have a lot more protections in place for employees. And Ohio and Michigan, I would say, are in between. There are 3 categories. Extreme protection for the employee, no protection for the employee, and the middle ground, some protection for the employee. And we'll get to the violations of public policy in a minute that might be available to the ones who are in between or the ones who don't provide any protection. But the question is, are there circumstances under which you can be kept at that church even if they don't want you to be there anymore? And it's kind of a ridiculous argument, because who wants to work where they're not wanted or appreciated? So it usually turns into a question of money. If you're terminated, do they owe you any money? And keep in mind, the courts don't like to get into situations like that. So the violations of public policy are the ways where the church can have its its nose rubbed into the mud, so to speak, if they don't comply with fair standards in handling you and terminating you. But they're not easy to prove. And let's talk about that case in Redford. It's an important case because it's one of the few that's actually gone to the United States Supreme Court. And the majority decision was written by Justice Roberts, and it was just issued, I think, in January of this year. So you Google that on your computer, and you'll get Roberts' actual decision, you'll get commentary, all kinds of things. But basically what happened is this Lutheran Church Missouri Synod up in Redford, Michigan, and this lady was an employee of the school, and she was a minister. There were two possibilities, minister, non-minister. She was a minister, but all she did was give a prayer occasionally. Well, it's easy to see what the church was trying to do. They were trying to get her into that minister category so the courts couldn't interfere with the way they treated her. Now, she had some kind of a serious sleeping disorder. And the church, they would say this at least, handled her very nicely. They gave her a lot of time off, perhaps even beyond what she was entitled to, perhaps beyond what anybody else got or would have gotten. They paid her. Benefits kept rolling in. But at some point in time, they decided it wasn't going to work. She couldn't come back to work and do the job, so they let her go. Well, she went to the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and predictably, they held up for her, said it was wrongful termination. Went to the federal district court, and the federal district court held for the church. So then it went to the Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati, which is where that court sits, which reversed it again, held for the employee. And then it went to the United States Supreme Court, which finally held for the church. And what it's all about, just in a nutshell, is whether the religious exemption is broad enough to include this woman. And it's a troubling case because it's so fact-sensitive that probably it doesn't carry any precedential value. Any other case that comes along, even one like it, might turn out with a different result. So I don't know what good it is, but it's interesting that the Supreme Court of the United States went so far as to hear the case. So went back and forth until finally they held up for the church. And not good news for us, I suppose, but keep in mind that courts don't like to meddle in First Amendment, at least religious freedom cases. So, one to keep in mind. Want to talk about worship styles? This is all about communication. From the first you read about the job, at least your first Sunday, maybe all the way through to your last Sunday. And here are things that you're going to be looking at, and you're going to be communicating in the following way. The church is communicating with you through the advertisement, the initial contact, you talk to each other, the first meeting, the interview, the audition. You want to meet other people in the church, meet former employees, and then the final meeting, and then you're on the job. So you want to be sure you got an understanding, a meeting of the minds with the church as to what your job is. And here are some questions to ask, and I want to add to number one. I want to make sure you have the updated version, because I left out who plans worship, and that's pretty important. You want to know whether that's your responsibility, don't you? And I think you also want to know whether the church follows the lectionary. Because if they don't, you may be getting the hymns on Sunday morning or Saturday night, and it's going to be harder to find, shall we say, hymn-based preludes, postludes, things like that you may want to do, because you've always done it and it works. How many services do you have? Why do you have 2 or 3 services a week? It seems to be if you're having 3 services a week and all 3 are blended, what's the reason for that? Just so people can worship at the time of day that they want to worship, so they can play golf? Tea time is going to interfere with worship? Well, that's fine, but is that a good use of resources? 3 identically blended worship services on one weekend. I don't think so. Where have you been musically, and where are you now? Where do you hope to be? Have previous employees fulfilled your needs? What skills and abilities? What does the congregation support? You know, you don't want to walk in with a preconceived notion of what good music